Hello, my name is Jody Best, and I've been asked to report on my findings of recent studies on minorities and special education and gifted programs. There are many underlying reasons why minorities have been underplaced in special education programs. When you boil down all the variables, four major factors remain. 1. Minority students' academic level is lower at school entry. 2. School percentages of minority being higher brings down the likelihood that students are recommended for special education, as minority students tend to live in the same areas. 3. The lower the test scores at the school, the less likely minority students will be recommended. And 4. Minorities will culturally engage differently in classrooms than non-minority students, which affect how learning is assessed and special education recommendations made. These factors can be further divided into individual factors and school factors. Hibble et al. States that a student who is frequently engaged in classroom tasks is less likely to be placed in special education. This engagement helps to determine learning levels. However, without differentiating instruction to meet the needs of all students culturally, there is no way to know for certain. The second individual level factor is students' test scores at entry to kindergarten. The more students were able to understand, the less likely they were to be placed. While these individual factors are true for all, they are especially significant for minority students because of the overall school factors. The two school factors that have been the biggest effect on minorities being underplaced are school test scores and school minority percentages. Hibble et al. State that much of the negative effect of minority status on special education placement is attributed to the students of minority, either in race or ethnicity, attending schools with high minority student enrollment. The idea being that when there are more minority students, it is easy for minority students to slip between the cracks, as there are more students with the same or greater needs. While this is good news since there's no evidence that we are overplacing minorities in special education programs, it also means that we are not providing students with the tools and services to help them succeed, which is a big problem. The other half of this argument is the placement of minorities in gifted education. The overall issues for minority placement are really from start to finish. From recruitment to identification and placement, we are doing a disservice to these students. The first major issue and barrier is in recruitment. Because all parties enter a classroom with preconceived notions about races other than our own, there is a major gap in the recruitment of minority students. Donna Ford said, perceptions about racial and ethnic minority students combined with a lack of cultural understanding and competence significantly undermine the ability of educators to recruit culturally different students into gifted education and AP classes, and to retain them once recruited, i.e. identified and placed. The first part of that barrier stems from what we call deficit thinking. Ford defines deficit thinking as when educators interpret differences as deficits, dysfunctions, or disadvantages. Consequently, she also says that many racially and ethnically different students, those not from the mainstream culture, quickly acquire an at-risk label, and the focus is on their perceived shortcomings or weaknesses rather than their strengths and potential or possibility. This prevents us from seeing giftedness and blocks minority students from excelling. Sorty was quoted as in Donna Ford's paper as saying, the less we know about them, the more uncomfortable we feel among them. The more uncomfortable we feel among them, the more inclined we are to withdraw. The more we withdraw from the people, the more faults we find with them. The less we know about their culture, the more we seem to dislike it. And the worst of it is that in the end, we begin to believe the very lies we've invented to console ourselves. Another recruitment issue and barrier is the entire process by which we screen for gifted and talented programs. First and foremost, student must be referred to the screening process by a teacher. As we have already discussed, deficit thinking remains a huge issue. Secondly, the screening process is based on a checklist of criteria that completely ignores how giftedness manifests itself differently in different cultures. Thirdly, the screening process relies on strong verbal skills. If students have limited English skills, they will automatically be eliminated from the process. Lastly, the recruitment process is dependent on students having the ability to demonstrate their giftedness due to cultural differences. Another issue in the process of identifying gifted and talented students is in the identification and assessment process. Test scores play a dominant role, but different tests put emphasis on different skills and abilities, and schools are not likely to choose tests that put emphasis on abilities that are not important to its dominant culture. Unfortunately, students that are culturally different will not perform well. There's also the issue of how results are interpreted. In Ford's paper, it is said, if a student is not gifted in ways that are valued by my culture, is the student gifted? Based on current practice, most culturally different students are not likely to be perceived as gifted. Now, the last obstacle in the flagging of gifted students is that we often equate giftedness with high achievement and productivity, but that is not the case. In theory, the issue of underachievers being overwhelmed in gifted education programs may be a valid concern, depending on why the students are underachieving. In practice, it has harmed gifted students who are members of racial, ethnic, and language minorities. Ford said many racial, ethnic, and language minority students are likely to be gifted underachievers or potentially gifted students. Some educators do not wish to place these students in gifted education programs and AP classes because they believe that the level and pace of schoolwork may frustrate these students. Now, what we have found is that that's actually not the case. They're not frustrated, they just lack the support. Ford said that instead of supporting diverse students and helping them to overcome their weaknesses and achievement barriers, educators have often chosen the option of least resistance under the guise of altruism. I don't want him to be frustrated. She'll be unhappy. He'll just fall farther behind. As we seek to prevent students from being frustrated, we should ask, what are we doing to help alleviate their frustrations? Tutoring, counseling, and other support systems, academic, vocational, social, emotional, are essential. When placement is combined with support, gifted underachieving students are more likely to be successful in gifted education and AP classes. Now, the question has been raised, which is the bigger issue, that students are underplaced, that minority students are underplaced in special education or gifted education? And I hate to take the middle of the line here, but I believe they're both equally important and equally as big of an issue, because in general, it means that we are not providing students with an appropriate education to fit their needs, which we are legally supposed to be doing. Having a multicultural outlook on education would help retain gifted minority students and help to identify special education minority students, because we will be looking for the things that are culturally going to help these students, and we're going to be differentiating our instruction. What's interesting to me is that as I read more and more about special education and gifted education and the things we can do to improve them, it really is just best practices. Differentiating instruction isn't just going to be good for the students that struggle or the students that excel. It's going to be good for all students. So really, what we're asking educators to do is be good teachers. And the better teachers we are, the more we're going to be able to reach the students of all skill levels and all ethnicities.